EMS Associate Editor Pilar Marrero, and I welcome you to today's Ethnic Media Services News Conference. The topic of today's briefing is actually a series that we're starting, 3 parts. We're going to have one part today, another part next week, and another part December 8th. And it is about something that concerns us all here in the United States. We are about a year away from to 2024 presidential elections, obviously, and we are wondering about America and our democracy and how it's going to perform in this coming year. So the series is called American Democracy in Decline, and today's topic is the potential for a constitutional crisis. This is something that people who are out there in the news and writing are talking about, and we want to know what it is, because it seems something that it can be many, many different things. What is a constitutional crisis? How we recognize it? And are we sliding towards one? Experts have many definitions of what a constitutional crisis is, from a party that embraces a cult of personality, to refusing to accept the results of an election, to rising authoritarian sentiments, to powerful political actors systematically violating the Constitution and the law, to an operational crisis where the system fails to handle significant challenges facing the nation. Our panel will engage with ethnic media, with you, to discuss this subject, to help us understand its signs and how to cover this critical topic, which may be on the table before or after the 2024 election. Our speakers include Seth Masket, professor at the Department of Political Science and director of the Center for American Politics at the University of Denver, Aziz Hoque, scholar of United States and comparative constitutional law at the University of Chicago Law School, Gloria Brown Marshall, professor of constitutional law at John Jay College, CUNY in New York. She's also an author, a playwright, and writer-host of Emmy Award-winning animated series Your Democracy. I think she placed the link to some of her videos in the chat. And unfortunately, our 4th panelist, Claire Bond Potter, could not join us today. She was set to participate, but this morning wasn't feeling well, and she apologized and said she will be happy to be with us in a future briefing. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat. Then we will address them following the roundtable, the discussion of the questions that I have for the experts in our table today. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions throughout the conference in the chat if they are able to. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. Instead of presentations, which we usually do, we're going to have a roundtable discussion. So I'm going to pose some questions and I'm going to call on the different speakers to chime in and give us their take on that question. But we will get to your questions, reporters, so please put them in the chat. All right, so this is the first question, and I'm going to go around in no particular order, but in the order that I have here in front of me, just to make it easy. First, can you share with us what's your definition, if you have one, of a constitutional crisis, and how do we recognize one? Seth, maybe you want to start.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. So I wanted to mention I did an article at the website 538 a few years back with another political scientist, Julia Azari, just trying to address this exact question of what exactly is a constitutional crisis. I won't go on for too long, but we had basically 4 different types of them. We were concerned. There were a crisis where the Constitution doesn't exactly say what to do in a circumstance. So, for example, in 1841, President William Henry Harrison died in office, and the Constitution at that point didn't say that the vice president becomes president. He just kind of asserted himself, and that became the tradition after that. But that's a potential crisis there where it's not clear what's supposed to happen. Another crisis is where the Constitution itself is unclear about the government. So, for example, in the 1850s, it was unclear whether the federal government could regulate or eliminate slavery in states. We ended up having a civil war to answer that question. A third type of crisis is where institutions just sort of fail. We might think of a government shutdown along those lines. Um, but a fourth, and I think this is probably the most relevant today, is where the Constitution actually says what to do, but it's not politically feasible. That is just people don't want to do it. So impeachment might be a good example of this. Like the Constitution provides a way to get rid of a president who is not doing the job correctly. We have so far never actually removed a president from office through impeachment. Arguably the founders set the bar too high for doing that. It requires too many senators to sign on to that. The Constitution didn't allow for the role of parties or didn't expect the role of parties. So I think that's probably the most descriptive of where we are today. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Gloria Brown Marshall, do you want to chime in?
Yes, I would add another example, and that is when the Supreme Court speaks, but one of the branches, or maybe both, refuse to follow the dictates of the court. And that's also where we are right now. Given what may or may not happen in 2024, we could have a court that gives a particular directive through a decision and have the executive branch decide not to follow it, or find that an executive order that was given through the president is one in which the people begin to follow, even though the directive is unconstitutional, and people want to follow it anyway. So because it comes from the president. So those, I would just kind of add that on to the list.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Professor Hawk?
Hi, I think we're supposed to say our name before we speak, and I'll do that for the benefit of the translators. Aziz Hawk, University of Chicago. I think that in legal scholarship or lawyer circles, the phrase constitutional crisis is used in a number of different ways, but differently from the way that Seth and Gloria were defined the term. I think that lawyers tend to be very aware that the Constitution, like almost any piece of written law, has lots of gaps and lots of issues or questions that it either just doesn't answer, or it offers an answer that is ambiguous and points in two directions at once. And I think lawyers are also very aware that the Constitution is often the center of political contestation and conflict. And so I don't think that from the lawyer's perspective, either gaps or conflict over constitutional meaning or constitutional implementation necessarily count as a crisis, because these are pervasive features of our democracy or of our constitutional order since the 1780s. My sense is that when lawyers or law professors talk about constitutional crisis, what they mean is something sudden and acute, a heart attack, rather than a long-standing condition of hypertension, where some or all systems of government break down. And I think that the various ways in which the word crisis is used differ, depends on how many of those systems you think are necessary, or you think or you're paying attention to in making a judgment about things breaking down. So I think for some people, the prospect of a government shutdown is a kind of constitutional crisis. Other people would characterize that just as conflict that is taking a particular fork. Yet other people would say, well, you don't have a crisis until the entire system of governance set up under the Constitution is at the point of breaking, which is what happened in the 1850s prior to the Civil War. And I think, yeah, other people would say, well, look, a crisis, we ought to understand crisis by thinking about what the purposes of the Constitution are. And if you think that the purpose is to install a national democracy, what counts as a crisis is when that purpose, democratic self-government, goes off the rails. So I think those are slightly different definitions of crisis.
Thank you, Professor. Does the fact, so coming to the present moment, and we are looking at a year of elections that is very unusual, in my opinion. I, as a journalist, covered many elections starting in the late 80s. I don't remember an election such as the one we are going to be having over the next year. So we have a potential, almost certain candidate for president of one of our major parties facing several criminal and civil procedures. Does that not indicate that something is wrong with the system of government and laws? Who wants to start? You can raise your hand. Seth?
Thanks. Seth Masket again here. And my answer to this actually touches a bit on what Aziz was just talking about. That the Constitution, as he notes, is fairly short and vague. The problem isn't necessarily with the Constitution. In some ways, it's with political parties, which have stepped in to fill some of the void left by the Constitution itself. But for the most part, that has been a fairly useful adaptation over the years, where parties help political actors coordinate across different parts of the federal government, different between the state and the federal government and other things. But there was always an assumption that parties would nominate proper nominees who would not be a threat to democracy. If we look at what the Constitution says for who can actually serve as president, the restrictions on there are very few. It says you need to be 35, a natural-born U.S. citizen, and having been in the United States for 14 years. It didn't seem to occur to the authors of the Constitution to prohibit felons or prohibit someone currently in prison from running for office, because who would think to nominate such a person? But now we're there today. So, in some ways, that's maybe more of a crisis of the parties than of the Constitution itself. One area where we do see the Constitution in some ways defending itself, there's a couple of court cases right now about whether Donald Trump should be allowed to be on the ballot due to his participation in the actions on January the 6th, 2021. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits people who have taken part in an insurrection against the United States from serving in office. And the question now in court cases both in Minnesota and Colorado as to whether that applies to him and would keep him from the ballot. At least in some ways, this is an aspect of the Constitution defending itself. But there is a lot of vagueness there, and it's a little unclear just where the crisis lies.
May I just?
Yes, Gloria Brown Marshall.
Gloria Brown Marshall. I would add that the Constitution specifically speaks to insurrection. It doesn't speak to any other criminal offense, and there have been other people who have run for the office from prison with criminal records in all different array of positions in society. If one can pay the money and meet the basic criteria Seth has set out, then one can run for president of the United States. It's the insurrection issue that comes before us with this particular candidate. So I think the Constitution has worked well from the standpoint that anyone can. the question becomes of concern because of the insurrection provision, but also because this is an instance where it's quite plausible that the person is going to run and possibly win. When before you had all types of people who would put their name in the hat, you know, to run for president of the United States for whatever reason. But this is a time period in which it's not a joke candidacy anymore. There's an actual provision in the Constitution that's being triggered and a person who has a likelihood of winning. So I think those two things come together to cause somewhat of a political crisis.
Thank you, Professor Assis Hug.
I think what is distinctive about this moment is not the fact that there is a likely candidate under indictment. I think what is distinctive about this moment is that 2 of the 4 indictments that have been lodged concern the individual's efforts to subvert the democratic process and to prevent the lawful, proper counting of people's votes. Under circumstances in which a person has credibly demonstrated a willingness to engage in the anti-democratic use of political power, and where that's resulted in criminal prosecutions at both the federal and the state level, and where that person has articulated a willingness and intention to resort once more to the use of political authority to eliminate or remove from the political stage enemies, and to otherwise abuse the authority of the state to entrench either himself or his movement or his party in office, we have a distinctive situation. We have something that I think is observed in other democracies, especially fragile ones around the world, but doesn't have an exact parallel in American history. And I think that one thing that perhaps, I don't want to speak for Gloria and Seth, but I think one thing that those of us who, as a professional matter, observe this dynamic playing out is, I think for us, we understand, or many of us understand, that unless you have a commitment on the part of the main players in a political system to democracy, however good the system, it won't work and it won't produce the outcomes of interest to us, which at the core is the system is somehow responsive to changes in public opinion. And while we understand that as being foundational, as being a prerequisite, I think for many non-professional or non-political science, non-law spectators, many ordinary voters, very reasonably, they make judgments about how they feel economically, how they feel in terms of kind of overall judgment about where the country is going. And they don't necessarily perceive the fact that if you vote for somebody whose effective mantra is, I mean, and, you know, to modify something that has a historical precedent, you know, one person, one vote, one time, you're cutting short your own ability to exercise democratic control, to do the thing that empowers you in the future.
Thank you, Professor. And now that we're talking about Donald Trump, there was an interview, I don't know if you have read, he gave an interview to Spanish language network Univision, and he came out yesterday. And some of the stuff that he said, I mean, he's saying what he's going to do. And he was asked, would you weaponize the Department of Justice? Would you use the Department of Justice to prosecute some of your enemies? Like you say you're being prosecuted. He says that the trials he's in the indictments he has against him are political prosecutions. So he responded, yeah, I will do it. I will use the Department of Justice. And not just that, we know, because there's been reporting on that he is putting together a group of lawyers for the Department of Justice. So he can really have people who are loyal to him there. Not what happened before, where he arrived and there was a bunch of people that, didn't really follow his lead. So it seems to me that we have a candidate who may win, who is very, as many of your answers have also included this, but that is telegraphing, is saying directly, I'm going to do stuff that it's unusual. I'm going to do stuff that is anti-democratic. What happens if that comes to pass? What are the scenarios for 2025 if we have a president that disregards the laws? And I may say that people on the other side are accusing also Democrats of disregarding the laws. And I remember people accusing President Obama of being anti-democratic and so a socialist and all these things. There's all these accusations, but we do see this as a reality. Seth, Masket, what's your commentary about that?
Well, I think one thing that we're reminded, and going back to 2016 on this, is that a candidate promising to do things that undermine democracy or undermine the Constitution, or even doing those things in office, it doesn't necessarily move that many voters against him. This is not necessarily a vote killer. Now, we saw some things in last year's midterm elections where, those who were saying things that were a little too close to where Trump was were, lost some votes for it. But for the most part, you can still be a very competitive candidate and be promising to do all sorts of things that undermine democracy. That's in many ways not where the check on anti-democratic behavior should be. We can't really rely on on voters themselves to screen that out. It's part of the reason that there are a variety of safeguards for that, why there is an impeachment process, and theoretically why parties could be screening out this behavior even if they don't. I think some of this also goes to, and I think again, similar to some of the things Aziz was saying, I think it's important to distinguish between the Constitution and democracy. The Constitution itself is not inherently a democratic document. That is, it has aspects of it that are very democratic, the House of Representatives, elections, and so forth. It also has some aspects that are less democratic or even counter-democratic, including, to some extent, the Senate, the Electoral College, the Supreme Court. And I think, there are some things that Trump is threatening that may be more of a threat to democracy than to the Constitution itself.
Yes. Professor Brown Marshall?
I would like to give two examples and then circle back. First, I don't see the major difference in 2016 in the rhetoric that led up to his election. He said that he could shoot someone in Times Square and still be elected. So the fact that he's running for office and then saying that he could shoot someone and he's still elected, I remember being on a news program as a legal commentator and saying, Trump said he could kill somebody in Times Square and still be elected. I was inundated with emails, and the emails said, that's where they're very clear. He didn't say kill someone. He said shoot someone. Get it straight. So I took from that that the people who are following him, are following based on emotion not based on law, not based on the caliber of moral compass the person has. So discussing the Constitution is one thing, and this is my second point. The conservatives have had monthly discussions about the Constitution for years. I don't see progressives doing that at all. And so even though what they're saying in these monthly meetings may be a misconstruction, misinterpretation, or just blatantly wrong, but they are actually incorporating the Constitution into their daily lives. And for the most part, I don't see progressives, liberals, whatever you may call it, Democrats, incorporating the Constitution in a way that makes it a real document that can be used or weaponized, because conservatives have weaponized the Constitution and made it their own based on their own version of what it says. And so my concern then is, we have a candidate who is acting just, hardened more so than he was in going into 2016, but also people who are hardened in their stance to follow him like lepers over the cliff. And we need to understand what is their interpretation of the Constitution, that they don't see something wrong with this behavior, and they believe that someone who is leading the highest office should have it. I'll follow back to this one point. A student of mine said, but he was good for the country economically. And I've seen that happen many times, where people have divided up the constitutional approach of a person running for office from what they can do economically in a capitalist country to help their pension funds, or to give them more money, or give them a sense of prosperity. So the constitutional aspect of this country, which is supposed to bind all of us in our differences, is some way sutured together, and the stitches are coming apart from what our day-to-day lives are. The more people are unaware of what the Constitution says and what the history of the country is regarding constitutional alliance with the democracy we claim we have, the more people, as it's pulled apart, are willing to just go their own way and the Constitution be damned.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Huck, Assis Huck.
I think this builds upon what Seth and Gloria have said, and I'd make 2 points. The first is, it's clearly a mistake to think that our democracy is perfect or anywhere near perfect in the United States. There are many, many problems, many kinds of exclusions and limitations and distortions that are, I think, indefensible on any plausible view of what a democracy should look like. So we shouldn't start from the premise that we have a perfect democracy, but at the same time we can recognize that the system that we do have can get much, much worse, and it can get so bad that it becomes extremely difficult to make positive change, either with respect to democracy or with respect to other elements of people's lives that matter in the future. So you don't have to think that democracy is great now to worry about it getting much worse in the future. The second point that I would make, going back to Pilar's question, is one of the, I think, really striking things about the recent polling has been the break, or the increase in support among particularly Black voters, but not exclusively Black voters, among ethnic and racial minorities, for a candidate who has not just flirted with overt white supremacists, but whose policies in many ways advance the interests of those groups. And it is really, I think, easy to forget how important both the sentiments and the at least in the context of protests and counter-protests, the actual members of groups of avowed white supremacist organizations are these days in a way that was not the case 10 years ago in any part of the visible political spectrum. And so one of the things I think that just to pick up on what Gloria said about a focus upon the economy among some people is, even if you think that's correct, which I'm a little skeptical of, when you vote for a candidate, you buy a package, and the package includes the elements of the coalition that candidate is close to. And there are coalitions now that incorporate and even celebrate overt white supremacism with all of the policy consequences that entails.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat by Henrietta Burrows, the one about who determines what a threat to democracy is. Henrietta, you want to ask your question? Henrietta?
Thanks so much, Pilar. Yes, it seems to me that both contending sides could say that they are the ones who are defending democracy. And I would think my next question in the chat was going to be, would you say the changing demographics is what's really driving this so-called constitutional crisis, with white supremacists trying to hold on to power and seeing those who are asking for more and more power a threat to their traditional ways of doing things? So they are then saying that they are the upholders of the democratic process as they attempt to hold on to power.
If I might just chime in on that one. One thing that Z said was about the Black voter, but the sense that the first term of Donald Trump, and hopefully it will be the only one, but the first term of Donald Trump, when he was actually in the midst of so many incidents involving women, and yet women voters gave him, I believe, 52%, and the second time 54%. Latino voters gave him the vote in, I think it was 33 to 34% during a time when he was talking about sending people back and building a wall and all of that. So there is this conflict between, and people have done this over time. So I'm not just, picking on these particular groups, but people have voted against their interests. We have poor people who are voting against the economic interests. We had people with no health insurance voting against those health insurance issues, and Obamacare, or wanting to vote against Obamacare and pleading against it. But I will say what Henrietta pointed out is crucial. By the year 2045, based on the US Census, and I've been following this for the last 20 years, this country is going to be majority people of color. That was known to me 20 years ago. That it was actually, they had it at 2060, and little by little is now down to 2045. And this is a sense of the foundation that's, as I said, they have meetings, we really don't. And in their meetings, they're concerned with the lessening of power. And it's not that, as Henry, I was just going to tweak your question a little bit, it's not that people are being given power. People are getting power because of the opening up of what was before racial segregation, sexism, and other, xenophobia and everything else that was taking place, and the ability to stop the caps on immigration that had lessened the number of people of color from particular countries and kept it very high for European countries. So all of that's taking place at the same time. That could be, depending on how this goes in 2024, the foundation for apartheid by 2045, with the sense that it is intended to maintain white control. And that's also a pattern in this country. The nativism is one that's been going on since the 1800s, when this country was made artificially white. It was not made, in a natural way. It's been an unnaturally created country and is unnaturally maintained to have a white majority. And all of these different systems, economic, political, and otherwise, are put in play in order to maintain this. And so I think that's a great question, Henrietta. But I also think that given the Supreme Court and the supermajority of conservatives on the Supreme Court, there's more of a chance long-term for this to happen if the executive branch becomes conservative, and those conservative executive branch coattails lead into other terms of conservatives.
Oh, that was intense. Seth or Assis, do you want to add anything?
I'll just agree with what Gloria was saying there. Just to note, like, one of the things that's really been driving a lot of what we're seeing over the last 10 years has been this a real shift in the Republican Party, which has, for a long time been the more conservative party, but there's been something of a, kind of a populist takeover of the party that predates Donald Trump. Really, it goes back arguably decades, but there was a lot of this growth in this populist outlook, stems from, a lot of white reactions to what they see as demographic change in the country. They see Barack Obama's presidency. They see themselves as losing ground relative to people of color. And that we just have a lot of evidence in political science and political psychology research that sense of whites feeling like they're losing ground to others as fueling kind of an anti-democratic turn. And people who are willing to tolerate a lot more anti-democratic rhetoric and anti-democratic behavior by politicians if they think it will sort of address what they see as a wrong, what they see as them being deprived of their their ability to stay in charge. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence backing that up.
Thank you, Professor Huck.
I think I would very briefly elaborate on one point that I think is implicit in what Seth said, which is part of what we're seeing is a dynamic organized around very old ideas of what Du Bois famously called the wages of whiteness. Part of it, and it intertwines in unexpected and complex ways. Part of this is a story about economic class and the way in which the gap between the extremely wealthy in the United States and both everybody else, but especially the bottom 20 or 30%, has widened and widened since the 1970s. One of the consequences of that widening is a dramatic spike in what the economists Angus Deaton and Anne Case call deaths of despair. And one of the points that that Deaton and Case make is that if you look at these deaths of despair, deaths by suicide, deaths as a consequence of the opioid crisis, and the like, those are distributed across both the white and the black and and other racial and ethnic minority populations in the United States. So it's worth remembering that braided into the long American history of racial antagonism and hierarchy is this other story in which people are experiencing tremendous harm and loss that is economic in one narrow sense, but that in many instances manifests as addiction, pain, and even death.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Talking about the Constitution again, I came across this article in political website talking about the new House Speaker and his ties to the evangelical inspired Convention of States. Have you guys heard about this? So we now have a Speaker of the House that seems to be on an extreme right-wing position. And he has ties with this group from around the country that want to remake the Constitution into an evangelical version. I don't know what this article implies, whether the fact that he's the Speaker of the House is going to give this group any movement forward, etc. But just are there any significant pushes for reform that you think the Constitution on the other side, let's say on the progressive side, that people are pushing, or is this only, as Gloria was saying, only coming from one side of the political spectrum? And is this realistic? Can something like this happen?
I mean, we're still trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed on the progressive side, if you look at it that way. My concern is, and this is something Seth raised before, the pillars that allow the Constitution to defend itself. And so the amendment process is such a laborious process for the Congress as well as each state, that it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. But if you look at the proposed amendment, you can see how the walls have prevented these proposed amendments, such as marriage shall only be between a man and a woman. And all, there have been so many different ways in which people have thought of ideas in which they want to make this a Christian country. And the framers of the Constitution did not want this to be a Christian country. They'd studied enough of the other governments to know that religious wars would tear the country apart. Of course, these are the same people who, many of whom believed in slavery, not all of them, and kept that going. But religion was one thing they did not want the country to fall prey to. So I think that the battle for the morality compass for the evangelicals, who also support Donald Trump with everything that he's doing, is once again led in an emotional way, where people pray for the Israelis but say Jews will not replace us. So there's a confusion at the core of the evangelical movement of what religion is. And I am a person who's a follower of certain religion, but I think that there have always been people in the House, in the Senate, on the Supreme Court, in the White House, who have been believers in a particular religion. How that religion plays out in their use of power, I think, is the core of your question.
Yes, absolutely. Who else wants to? Professor Huck?
I don't want to speak in respect to the speaker in particular. I will say that one of the ways in which the role of religion in public life is changing is as a consequence of the changes to the Supreme Court that follow from President Trump's 3 appointments. The court has now, not for a decade, found any measure to violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And at the same time, it's adopted a much more aggressive view of, or expansive view of the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause. And probably the most important consequence of that view of the Free Exercise Clause is that individuals have a right to opt out of general regulation, even when doing so imposes a harm to a third party. an example of this are instances in which physicians or companies providing or paying for health insurance can opt out of paying for certain procedures or performing certain procedures, even where doing so will have predictable, targeted harms to others. I think it's easy to think of religious liberty as a win, or an expansion of religious liberty as a win. And the point that I would draw attention to is it's really important to think about how or where costs of new species of constitutional right fall. And I think that what we may be seeing with the Supreme Court's view on religious liberty is an account of the First Amendment's free exercise clause that is particularly likely to lead to the exercise of religious liberty in ways that produce harms to groups that are already vulnerable and marginalized in society. One can argue about whether that is or is not the original understanding of the Constitution. Seth in the comments has already, I think, wisely cautioned us against that kind of language as being facile and misleading. Those are my words, not his. But I certainly think that in thinking about things like the discussions around Mike Johnson, it's worth bearing in mind that we're already seeing something somewhat akin to that in another context.
Seth, do you want to say something? Okay. All right. So coming back to the original idea of our series, do you see signs of decline in our democracy at this moment? And I'm sure it's not the first time it happened, and it's not a completely different situation from another time where we had certain types of crisis. But do you think that our democracy is in decline when we have, for example, the institution of elections being called into question by so many people? So many people in this country thinking that elections were stolen here and there, in 2016, and some people think they were stolen in 2000. But clearly that was not the same kind of crisis. Do you agree there's a decline there? And what is it exactly? Where are we going exactly with this decline?
If I could just say one thing, as an African American whose family dates back well over a century and a half, 2 centuries, I would say, that when I'm discussing this question now, I wonder historically, why wasn't it seen as a constitutional crisis when millions of people of color, not just African Americans, but Native Americans, Latinos, and Asians, were fighting for their right to vote? So what has happened, as is pointed out sometimes, that African Americans are the canary in the cage. We have a critical mass of a population of 13 to 15% that allows the African American experience to be more vocal nationally and internationally, more so than, say, people of African descent in Canada or in the UK. And so because of that, there are enough books written, enough people who have protested, enough times in which we should know as a nation, and journalists should know from the Black press and from other presses, how this country has undermined the rights of people of color. I think it's interesting to note that it becomes a constitutional crisis when it starts to undermine the rights of the middle class, undermine the rights of white Americans. Then all of a sudden we're debating the constitutional crisis. This is my probably 5th or 6th panel I've been on discussing the constitutional crisis that's now supposed to be in play, when I know that if we are defining constitutional crisis in a way that takes into account millions of people unable to vote, then we would have defined it to include a century ago and going forward. My last point is, Someone put in the chat, I thought was a really good point. Are we expecting, if we are in a constitutional crisis involving the upcoming election, will the Electoral College self-correct? And I think that goes to something that Seth raised before about, does the Constitution itself have a self-correcting device or something that allows it to defend itself, even if we do fall into what by all of our definitions becomes a constitutional crisis?
Wants to comment on that, Seth or Aziz? Seth?
I mean, what Gloria just said is right on, I think. And, you know, arguably this country has only, you know, really been a functioning multiracial democracy since roughly 1965. And it just sort of, you know, speaks to that it's a little more fragile, I think, than we tend to give it credit. And, you know, if you look at opinion polls shortly after the election, it's pretty common for voters in the party that just lost a presidential election to complain that there was some fraud, there was something wrong with the election. That usually goes away fairly quickly on its own. People don't feed a lot of those fires. The big difference lately has been that, you know, now you have candidates saying that. You know, Donald Trump being, you know, the most notable of them, but, you know, you've had a number of, again, mostly on the right, senatorial, gubernatorial, and other candidates who, when they lose, they claim that there was fraud, and they continue to sustain that, and it gets a fair amount of media attention, and it just kind of continues to sustain that belief. At a certain point, like a functional democracy is dependent on a party being willing to lose, and, you know, being able to accept that, well, they'll have a shot at winning next time. So you have this sort of, you know, there's always this potential veto threat by the losing party that makes this look, you know, just a little more tenuous through those eyes, and that is definitely a major concern for 2024. And definitely an area where we have seen, you know, some significant democratic erosion in the United States over the last decade.
Thank you, Professor Hawk. Need to add that something?
I would again second, I think, Gloria's really important historical point. I would maybe extend it by noting that there was a period of multiracial democracy in the United States in the 1870s through, in some places, to the beginning of the 1890s. And that collapses, and it collapses in the South into a political system in which one party has a monopoly on power, thanks to the exclusion of Black voters, first informally and then formally, which is cemented with a system of violent dispossession in the form of Jim Crow. I think it is not unreasonable to be concerned that the United States might be moving into a period in which it's not simply that certain voices are marginalized, but that the failure to maintain a system of competitive elections in which, as Seth rightly said, a party can lose and the loser gracefully steps away to play again another day, right? The way in which that gets lost is through both law and through violence. This happened in the 1880s and 1890s. And I would anticipate that the cost of that violence would once again fall upon communities and individuals who are historically marginalized and vulnerable. So I think that history that Gloria has identified and put back on the table is a really important one in thinking about what kind of paths we're likely to see, you know, under certain versions of the future.
Thank you so much. And we're about to close pretty soon in a few minutes. So I want to ask all of you to tell us, reporters, journalists, especially in the ethnic media, what should we be covering in this realm, in the political realm, in the upcoming year? What is something that we would need to, or it would be good for us to focus on? What kinds of stories can really illuminate this moment for our communities that read what our ethnic media put out? What would be your advice? Gloria, go ahead.
If you would please start covering the judicial elections and the state judge elections. In most states, judges run for election and run for re-election. We see what happened in South Carolina and how important that election was. We just had an election in New York State. I didn't know these judges. Nobody's reporting on their cases. And there are so many news deserts in communities of color where people don't know who's running. They don't know the records of these judges. And the conservatives are honing in on state and local races, and in particular, the judges, because most of the cases are in state court, not federal court. And so I think it's very important for us to understand, from criminal justice to family court, to our basic rights, medical malpractice or anything else, what these state court judges are doing, what their backgrounds are, and if you can, some of the criminal cases, outcomes that you could cover in your news broadcasts or papers.
Thank you. Seth?
Thanks. Yeah, what I was going to say is actually it's along similar lines to what Gloria was saying, that one of the more significant aspects of our democratic crisis is the decline in local news media right now, and that's we've just seen like a steady decline in the number of local newspapers, the number of newspapers covering local elections or state politics, and increasingly people get their news from national news sources, from CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post. Which means a lot of local stuff gets lost. And there's a lot of, there's a number of studies suggesting that when politicians are covered more aggressively, it tends to cause them to moderate, to achieve more of what people in their districts want. It just sort of makes for a healthier democratic system. And that's not something we can, fix overnight. But I think that is a story that should get more attention, just the changes in the media landscape and how it covers politics.
Yes, thank you. Professor Huck?
I would point to low-lying or slow-moving stories that I think are really important. The first is one of the issues that is going to be lurking in the background to the 2024 election is entitlement reform, as it's euphemistically called sometimes. But the better way to put it is to what extent the government will stand behind the systems of social support that make many people's lives more livable, particularly members of economically marginal or otherwise vulnerable populations. And we all like to think that we're independent. We all like to think that we're capable of standing on our own 2 feet. But that nice belief can be leveraged if by in political rhetoric, if people are not aware of the full consequences of measures, let's say, dramatically reducing Social Security, dramatically reducing Medicaid, Medicare, support for housing, support for food stamps, support for SNAP, and the like. And I think that all that what the political scientists call deregulatory agendas or neoliberal agendas is there in this campaign, and I don't think it's getting the attention that it needs to. The second thing I'd flag is many states in the wake of the 2020 protests against police killing many states have enacted measures that make it lawful to use physical violence against public protests. For example, it's lawful in certain states like Oklahoma and Florida now to purposefully run people over if you are quote unquote fleeing a protest. One thing, and these are measures that are pressed by Republican politicians. They're embraced by some of the white supremacist groups that I mentioned earlier. And I would urge people who are reporting in those states to really look hard at the way that not just physical violence is becoming more and more common in political public contexts, but the ways in which that violence is being legalized and made routine.
Well, I feel like I've learned a lot in this hour, and I hope everyone got something out of it. Some stories are produced. I appreciate you panelists taking the time to do this, and for my colleagues to have been here. Next week, we're going to continue this series talking about the threats to the 2024 election. In the meantime, we'll see you around. Have a good weekend.